Why's the old girl dancing? Somebody get her a chair before she shakes apart." The words carried across the parade deck on a wind that had been blowing since before any of the young men on the cordon were born. Corporal Tyler Rourke said them for the benefit of the two Marines beside him, and they laughed, because that was what you did when Rourke handed you a laugh. The wind took the sound and flattened it and carried it on, past the ranks of empty folding chairs, past the reviewing stand with its skirt of red, white, and blue bunting, past the tall, shrouded shape at the head of the field that no one had yet uncovered. The old woman did not move against the wind. Her hands shook. Everything else about her was still. She sat at the end of the front row of guests in a plain red coat buttoned to the throat, a folded program held in her lap with the care of a woman who knew her fingers could no longer be trusted to hold anything lightly. She was 79 years old. Her hair was white and neatly pinned, regular and unremarkable, the hair of somebody's grandmother. The morning light came off the concrete in a hard, pale sheet and lay across her face and found nothing there to move. She watched the shrouded monument, the way a person watches a door they have been waiting 50 years to see opened. Around her, the base went about the business of a ceremony. It was a Marine Corps installation 2 hours inland, an old post with a long memory and a longer roll of names, and today it had come out into the wind to rededicate a monument to a reconnaissance company that had gone up a mountain in 1969 and had not all come down. There were folding chairs for 200 guests, and most of them were still empty. There were Marines in dress blues forming into a cordon along the walk. There was a band tuning in low, tentative notes that the wind kept stealing. And there was an old woman in a red coat who had arrived early, alone, on no one's arm, and had walked to the front row and sat down as though the seat had been kept for her since the last war. She had come early. She had come alone, on the first shuttle from the visitor lot, and she had asked the young Marine driving it only one question, which was whether the reconnaissance monument was the one at the head of the parade deck. And when he told her that it was, she had thanked him and said nothing else for the whole ride. She had walked the length of the deck without hurrying, past the band and past the empty chairs, and she had chosen the seat at the end of the front row, the way a person chooses a pew in a church. They have not entered in 50 years, but have never once forgotten. The base had a long memory. It had a museum with a wing for the fog war, and a chapel with a book of the fallen, and a wall of company guidance. And somewhere in all of that careful institutional remembering, there was a photograph of a reconnaissance team from 1969. 6 young faces, and if any of the busy people setting up the ceremony had thought to compare the oldest of those 6 faces to the old woman in the red coat, they might have caught the ceremony before it had to catch itself. No one did. She was, to the morning, only somebody's grandmother, early and alone, and the morning had a great deal to do. Sergeant Deacon Pruitt noticed her before anyone told him to. He was 29, the non-commissioned officer running the cordon detail, a lean man with a careful face, and the kind of quiet that older Marines learned to trust. He had joined the Corps because of a book his grandfather kept, a thick blue book of citations, and he had read that book so many times as a boy that he could still recite whole paragraphs of it. The strange, flat official language that described the worst mornings of men's lives in the voice of a filing clerk. He knew the Medal of Honor rolls the way other men knew batting averages. He could not have told you why the old woman caught his eye. Something in the way she sat. Something in the stillness that the wind could not get into. "Eyes front, Corporal," Pruitt said. "We're guests on our own deck today. Square it away." Rourke came to a lazy version of attention, and his 2 shadows with him. Lance Corporal Dane Whitcomb, 20, who filmed everything, and Private First Class Cole Ferris, 19, who laughed at everything Whitcomb filmed. Behind them stood a fourth, Private Toby Vance, 19, the newest of them, who did not laugh and did not film, and kept his eyes on the flag, as if he were afraid of what would happen if he looked anywhere else. Pruitt let his gaze go back to the old woman. The collar of her red coat had shifted in the wind, and for a moment he thought he saw something at her throat. A small ribbon, pale blue, the color of a winter sky, an hour before dark. Then the wind laid the collar back down, and it was gone, and he told himself he had imagined it, and he did not believe himself. The reviewing party was forming at the far end of the deck. Colonel Roy Ashford, 53, the installation commander, stood with his cover under his arm and his gloves in one hand, and even at that distance he had the look of a man conducting a service he took personally. The band settled. The chairs began slowly to fill, and still the old woman sat at the front, her hands trembling in her lap, her eyes on the shrouded stone, as if she could already read, through the cloth, the name she had come a long way to find. The wind came off the deck in another long, flat sheet. Her hands shook harder. She did not look away. The order to render honors came, and the color guard stepped off. They advanced up the center of the deck with the flag snapping, the national colors, and the Marine Corps standard, and the flag of the installation, and the command came down the line for all present to rise. Around the old woman, the guests came up out of their chairs, the way civilians rise, loosely, a beat late, hands drifting toward hearts. She rose differently. She rose without help. No one offered her a hand, and she reached for no one's arm. She came up out of the folding chair in a single unhurried movement that cost her something and did not show it, and she squared her body to the flag, heels together, chin level, and she brought her right hand up to the brow of her white head in a salute. The hand trembled the way a struck wire trembles, and it held the line exactly. Fingers joined and flat, thumb tucked, the tip of the middle finger at the outer edge of the brow, the forearm at its clean diagonal, the whole shape of it correct to the millimeter, and shaking, 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 and not moving 1 degree off true. She had rendered that salute 10,000 times across a life, and her body had not forgotten the shape of it even when age had taken away everything that came easy. The tremor lived in the muscle now. The discipline lived somewhere deeper, in a place the years could not reach, and it held the tremor inside the correct line, the way a riverbank holds a flood. She held it for the whole of the national anthem. Pruitt watched her and felt the hair stand on his arms. Civilians did not salute uncovered. Civilians laid a hand over the heart. Only those who had earned the right rendered the hand salute without a cover on their head, and even among those, almost none held it, unwavering for the full anthem, because almost none of them could. This one could. This one did. And when the wind pulled her collar again, he saw it clearly this time, and it didn't go away. The pale blue ribbon at her throat, and on it, so small he could not be sure, and was suddenly very sure, a spray of 5 tiny white stars. He knew that ribbon. He had known it since he was a boy at his grandfather's table. He forgot, for a moment, how to breathe. Rourke read the same trembling hand, and read comedy in it. He leaned toward Whitcomb, grinning. "Look at her go. Full send. You think she even knows the war's over?" Whitcomb snickered. Ferris snickered because Whitcomb had. The anthem climbed toward its high line, and the old woman's hand shook and held, and an usher, a young Marine in white gloves with a lanyard of self-importance, sidled up the row and bent to her ear to guide her back into her seat, because she had been standing a long time, and he had decided she was frail. "Ma'am, why don't we get you seated? We don't want you. I'll stand for the colors, son." Her voice was low and dry and entirely without heat. "Then you can square me away." Square me away. The usher blinked at the phrase, an old phrase, a core phrase, spoken in the flat cadence of someone to whom it had never been slang. He straightened and stepped back. Pruitt, 10 feet off, heard it too, and went very quiet inside, the way a man goes quiet when the floor of a familiar room turns out to be a great deal deeper than he thought. He had spent his boyhood inside that flat blue book, and he knew the arithmetic of the thing that ribbon meant. He knew how few there were. He knew that a Marine could serve a full career and pass a lifetime of parade decks and never once stand in the presence of the pale blue ribbon with the 5 white stars, and that when you did stand in its presence, the rule was simple and absolute, and older than any of the men enforcing it. You rendered honors first, rank be hanged, because the person wearing it had already given the country something that outranked everything a set of collar devices could say. He had recited that rule to himself, as a boy, the way other boys recited box scores. He had never imagined he would one day have to enforce it on a parade deck against one of his own corporals. For the sake of a woman, his own detail had spent the morning turning into a joke. The anthem ended. The last note went out across the deck, and the wind took it. The old woman lowered the shaking hand slowly, the way a person sets down something heavy they have carried a long distance, and she lowered herself back into the folding chair, and she folded her trembling fingers again over the program in her lap. And only Pruitt, of all the hundreds of people on that parade deck, understood that he had just watched something he was going to remember for the rest of his life. The formal opening released the crowd into a loose murmur while the dedication party assembled, and Rourke used the intermission to put on a show. He had an audience now, a growing knot of young Marines from other details drifting over between duties, and Rourke was a man who could not stand in front of an audience without performing. He stepped out where they could all see him, drew himself up with mock solemnity, and began to render the old woman's salute. He exaggerated the tremor. He made his whole arm quake, his hand flapping at his brow, his knees wobbling, his face contorted into the slack expression that cruel young men use to mean old. "Present," he called, in a warbling old lady voice. "Arms. Whoa, whoa, easy now. Why are you dancing, Granny? You're gonna take flight." The knot of Marines laughed. Whitcomb had his phone up and out, filming it in a wide grin, panning from Rourke's performance to the small, red-coated figure in the front row, and back. Ferris laughed so hard he had to put a hand on Whitcomb's shoulder. It was ugly, and it was loud, and it went on, the way cruelty goes on when it is being rewarded, each laugh feeding the next. The old woman heard every word of it. She did not turn her head. Her hands shook in her lap, and her face did not. She sat inside the noise the way she had sat inside the wind, unbothered, unhurried, a stillness the mockery could no more get into than the weather could. Once, quietly, to no one, to the shrouded stone, or to the man beneath the name on it, she said something that none of the laughing Marines could hear. "Let them laugh," she said. "The quiet ones are usually the ones under the stone." She had heard worse, in worse rooms, from men who should have known better. She had been told, across a long life, in 100 quiet institutional ways, that she had not been where she said she had been, and hadn't done what the record said she had done, because the shape of her didn't match the shape the story was supposed to come in. She had learned a long time ago that the world would rather laugh than look, and that it was not her job to make the world look, only to be quietly exactly what she was, and to let the looking happen or not happen, as it would. So she let the boy perform his cruelty. She had buried men who would have crossed that deck and taken the phone out of Whitcomb's hand and folded it in half, and she had loved them for it. And she had also long outlived the age when she believed that answering cruelty with force taught anyone anything worth learning. She sat, and her hands shook, and her face was a still gray sea, and she waited, because she had learned how to wait on a mountain, and nothing since had ever been harder than that. Private Vance heard it. He had drifted to the edge of the front row, near enough to catch it, and it went through him like cold water. He looked at the old woman, and then he looked at the wind, pushing her thin coat against her thin shoulders. And he did a small thing. He took 2 steps, took hold of her folding chair by the back, and eased it a foot to the left, into the shade of the reviewing stand, out of the hard, flat sun. He did not say anything. He was too frightened of Rourke to say anything. But he moved the chair. Rourke saw it and laughed, and, passing on his way back to the cordon, knocked the chair askew again with his hip, so that it scraped, and the old woman had to steady herself. "Careful, Vance. She'll charge you for the valet." More laughter. Vance flushed and said nothing, and quietly straightened the chair back. If you have ever stood in a crowd and watched the young forget what the old ones carried, and felt the wrongness of it move through you and had nowhere to put it, then stay with this old woman a while longer, because she is about to be remembered. And while you are here, subscribe to the Veteran Vault, so the ones who carried it in silence do not go unremembered on your watch either. It stopped being a joke a few minutes later, when a protocol officer decided the old woman did not belong. He was a young lieutenant with a clipboard and a seating chart, and an unhappy sense that the front row was reserved and that the small woman in the red coat was not on his diagram. Rourke, drifting back within earshot, saw the lieutenant frown at his chart and saw an opening and could not help himself. He stage-whispered, just loudly enough, that the old girl had probably wandered off a tour bus, that the visitor center was always losing one, that somebody ought to check whether she'd slipped the gate. The lieutenant, thus prompted, came and bent over the old woman and asked, politely enough, whether he might see her invitation. Her hands shook too hard to unfold the program cleanly. That was the cruelty of it, and Rourke saw the cruelty and fed on it. The thick tremor in her fingers turned the simple act of opening a folded card into a long, fumbling, painful thing, the card corners slipping, the paper trembling, and to a watching eye that wanted to see foolishness, it looked exactly like a confused old woman who could not manage her own program. Rourke let out a low, pitying whistle. "Ma'am," Rourke said, stepping in now, all false helpfulness gone hard at the edges. "This row's for family and honored guests, people who earned a seat here. Let's get you back to the coffee tent before you hurt yourself, all right? Come on." Around them, the other guests found things to study in their own programs. This was the part that the old woman had seen 100 times in a long life, in 100 rooms. The way the decent people look away when the cruelty is someone else's to stop. A man 2 seats down cleared his throat and examined the sky. A woman folded and refolded her order of service. No one rose. No one spoke. There were 200 decent people on that deck, and not one of them wanted trouble. And the wanting no trouble of decent people is the exact medium in which cruelty does its best work, the still water it needs to grow. She knew that, too. She had watched it in mess halls and in hospitals, and in the long waiting rooms of the years, the way the good people study their programs, and she did not blame them for it, because blame was another thing she had set down on the mountain and never picked back up. She only noted it, the way she noted the wind and the light. One more fact of the deck. The lieutenant with the clipboard hovered, uncertain now, caught between the seating chart in his hand and something in the old woman's stillness that the chart could not explain. He had the sense, the way a young man sometimes does, a half-second, before he understands why, that he was standing at the edge of a mistake. But Rourke was at his shoulder, feeding him the easy version, the wandered-off-a-bus version, and the easy version is the one a nervous young officer reaches for, and so he stayed where he was and let it happen. The old woman finished unfolding the program. She did it slowly, with great care, refusing to be hurried, letting her shaking hands take exactly as long as they needed. And when it was open, she smoothed it flat against her knee with one trembling palm and looked up at Rourke with eyes that were perfectly calm. "I am exactly where I am meant to be," she said. "I have been meant to be here for a very long time." And as she lifted her chin to say it, the collar of the red coat fell fully open in the wind, and the pale blue ribbon showed at her throat, whole and clear. 5 small white stars across a field the color of dusk. Pruitt was crossing the deck toward them by then, drawn by the tightening knot of the thing, and he saw it plainly, and he stopped mid-stride, as though he had walked into a wall. Rourke, who did not read ribbons, who had never opened his grandfather's blue book because he had no such book and no such grandfather and no such patience, saw only an old woman being stubborn. His hand came up and hovered at her elbow to lift her from the chair. From 10 feet away, low and flat and carrying, Pruitt said, "Corporal, do not touch her." Rourke turned, hand still hovering, and found his sergeant coming at him with a face he had never seen the man wear. Pruitt stepped in between the corporal and the old woman, and he was not loud, and that was what made it terrible. The loud ones you could laugh at. Pruitt was quiet the way a live wire is quiet. "Corporal Rourke," he said, "you are one word away from the worst afternoon of your career. Step back. Now." Rourke, because he had an audience, and because a man with an audience will do things he would never do alone, laughed. He spread his hands to the knot of watching Marines and rolled his eyes, playing it broad. "Sergeant's gone soft over the lost and found. Relax, Deke. I'm helping the lady find her tour group." Whitcomb, grinning, kept the phone up and filming. Pruitt did not look at Rourke again. He turned to the old woman, and he did something the corporal had not done and would never have thought to do. He took off no gloves. There was nothing to take off, but he stood at a loose parade rest and inclined his head with a respect that was entirely real, and he asked her, quietly, for her name. "Hollis," she said. "Winifred Hollis. I served with the company they're honoring today." Her shaking hand rose an inch toward the shrouded stone and fell back. "I came for one of them." Pruitt's face changed. It changed the way a landscape changes when a cloud goes off the sun. All at once, everywhere, the same ground, suddenly a different color. He knew that name. He had known that name since he was 9 years old, at a scarred kitchen table, reading a citation aloud to a grandfather who mouthed the words along with him because he knew them by heart. He had read the name Winifred Hollis in the flat clerk's language of the highest award his country gave, and he had never once, in 20 years of imagining it, thought that the name belonged to a living woman who might one day sit in a red coat in a folding chair in front of him and be laughed at by a boy with a phone. What the young man in the pressed uniform did not know, what none of them laughing behind him knew, was that the whole of the next few minutes had already been written, 57 years ago, on a mountain none of them could find on a map. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault and stay, because you are about to hear it read aloud to the entire deck. Pruitt looked from the old woman's shaking hand to the draped monument behind her, and understood that the name he was about to defend was already carved into the stone. The mountain, when she carried it, did not shake. Go back with her now, because no one else on that deck can. Go back 57 years, to the winter of 1969, to a ridgeline in the high country near the border where the fog came up the valleys at dusk and drowned the world in wet gray cotton, and did not lift again until long after there was nothing left to see. She was 22 years old. She was a reconnaissance Marine, jump qualified and dive qualified, attached to a small team that had gone up onto the ridge to watch a trail and had been found there, in the last light, by a great many people who did not want to be watched. The perimeter came apart in the dark. That was the thing about the fog. You could not see the men trying to kill you, and you could not see the men trying to stay alive beside you, and the whole fight collapsed down to sound and muzzle flash and the voices of your own people calling out how badly they were hurt. There were 6 on the team. By the time full dark came, there were 3 who could not walk, and the position could not be held, and the only way off the ridge was down 800 meters of black scree with the fog in it, and the enemy in the fog. Her hands did not shake on that mountain. There would be time for shaking later, 57 years of it, an ocean of it. But not then. Not with a man's whole weight slung across her back and 800 meters of black slope falling away below her boots. She took the first man down and came back up. She took the second man down and came back up. Each trip was an hour of feeling for the ground with the toe of her boot before she trusted it, of the wet stone sliding, of the terrible arithmetic of one more step, and each time she reached the bottom, she set the man down among the others and turned around and climbed back into the dark to get the next one, because there was no one else to do it, and because leaving him was not a thing her body knew how to do. She would be asked about it later by men with clipboards and by men with cameras, and once by a historian with a soft voice and a tape recorder, and she would never be able to give any of them the thing they wanted, which was the feeling of it, the arithmetic of the terror. She could give them the numbers. The ridge was 1,300 meters at its crown. The fog came in at 1,700 hours and did not lift for 11 hours. There were 6 of them at dusk and 3 who could not walk by full dark. She could give them the distances and the times, spelled out flat, the way the citation would later spell them out, because numbers were the only language cold enough to carry it without breaking. What she could not give them was the sound the mountain made, or the particular black of a fog that has a war inside it, or what it is to feel for the edge of the world with the toe of your boot in the dark, with a dying man's arms locked around your neck, and to find, each time, that there is one more step, and then one more, and then one more. The first man she took down had a shattered leg and did not make a sound the whole way, which frightened her more than screaming would have. The second man talked the entire descent, a low, steady river of talk, his sister's name, and a car he was going to buy, and the exact hamburger he wanted when he got home. And she answered every word of it, because his voice was the rope they were both climbing down. And when she set him at the bottom among the others, he stopped talking, and she almost went back up before she remembered there was still one more. She climbed back into the dark. She was 22 years old, and she had already made this trip twice, and her legs had stopped being legs and become only the machinery that carried other men. And she climbed back up into the fog and the muzzle flash to get the last one, because there was no one else, and because leaving him was not a thing her body knew how to do. The third man was Lance Corporal Sammy Cordell. He was 19 years old. He had a low country accent and an easy laugh, and a photograph of a dog he loved, and he had been hit in the descent, not on the ridge, hit late when they were almost down, when she had almost done it, when she had almost gotten all of them off that mountain alive. She got a hand over the wound and got her shoulder under him, and took the last of the slope one sliding foot at a time, with his blood going cold on her forearm and his voice going quiet in her ear. "Don't put me down, Hollis," he said. He said it more than once, the same words, softer each time. "Don't put me down." "I won't," she told him. "I never will. You hear me? I've got you. I never will." She held the line and she held him. She held both until first light, when the fog finally thinned and the helicopters found the trail and came in low and loud and took the living off the mountain. Sammy Cordell was not among the living by then. She had not put him down. She had carried him the whole way, and she was still holding him when they came. And it took 2 men to explain to her, gently, that she could let go now, that he was home, that she had brought him home. They gave her the Medal of Honor 2 years later, in a room with a flag and a man reading the flat clerk's language of it, all the whos and wheres and with complete disregards for her own safety. And she stood and received it, and it felt in her hands like it had always felt, and would always feel, like his, like a thing that belonged to a 19-year-old boy with a low country laugh and a photograph of a dog, and that she was only keeping for him, holding for him, until she could find the place with his name on it and give it back. The fog lifted on the memory and closed again on the present-day deck, on the wind and the bunting and the shrouded stone. And the same hands that had not shaken on that mountain, old now, ruined now by nothing worse than the long years she had been granted, and he had not, trembled in her lap. And now, if you have been paying attention, you understand at last what they are shaking under. Not weakness. Weight. The weight of a boy she never once put down. On the deck, Rourke decided he had been made a fool of, and a young man who feels he has been made a fool of will do the thing that makes it worse. He had heard his sergeant say, "Do not touch her," and he had felt the whole knot of watching Marines feel the strangeness in it, and he did not understand the strangeness, and so he did the only thing his kind of pride knew how to do. He decided the old woman was the cause of his embarrassment, and that removing her would remove the embarrassment. He stepped past Pruitt, reached down, and took Winifred Hollis by the upper arm to lift her out of the chair before she could shame the ceremony any further. His hand closed on the arm that had carried 3 men off a mountain. She did not resist him. That was the thing he would remember for the rest of his life, the thing he would still be turning over when he was an old man himself. That she did not pull away, did not stiffen, did not so much as tremble more than she was already trembling. She let his hand close on her thin arm, and she turned her head, slowly, and looked first at his hand, and then at his face. And when she spoke, her voice was as low and dry and calm as it had been all morning. "Son," she said, "the last time a man put his hands on me on high ground, I carried what was left of him home. Let go now, and go stand where you belong." There was a whole life inside the sentence, and Rourke heard none of it, and felt all of it. He did not know about the mountain, or the fog, or the 3 trips into the dark. He did not know that the words high ground and carried home were not a figure of speech in her mouth, but a plain description of the single worst and most important night of a long life. He only knew that the frail old woman he had been steering toward the coffee tent had said something to him in a voice that did not match the shaking hand under his fingers, and that the mismatch had opened a small, cold door somewhere behind his ribs, and that he wanted, very much, and without understanding why, to take his hand back. For one beat, the frailty went out of her eyes. It did not come up as anger. It came up as something worse than anger, something very old and very level, the look of a person who has already survived the worst thing the world can do, and has therefore nothing left to fear from a boy in dress blues. Rourke felt it go through him, like the cold, off the mountain he would never know about. His hand loosened on her arm without his deciding to loosen it. He took it back, and did not know why he had taken it back, and he laughed, one short, ugly laugh, to cover the chill that had just walked up his spine. Behind him, he did not see. The reviewing officer had left the stand. Colonel Ashford was walking, fast, straight up the center of the deck, and Sergeant Pruitt had already turned and was moving to meet him. The 2 of them converged on the front row from 2 directions, and Rourke, laughing his short laugh to the last of his shrinking audience, was standing exactly where they were both going. Pruitt reached the colonel first, and what passed between them was quick and low, and Rourke could not hear it. The sergeant said a name and a word. The name was Winifred Hollis. The word was the name of the ribbon at her throat. Ashford's eyes went to the old woman, to the pale blue field and its 5 white stars, and then to the program in his own gloved hand, to the line halfway down the honored guests, where he had glanced that morning and read past without stopping, and the color went out of the colonel's face. He was a man who had served 29 years and had rendered honors to exactly one living recipient of that medal in all that time, at a review long ago, and had never forgotten it, and had never expected to do it again, and had certainly never expected to do it here, to a woman in a red coat whom his own Marines had spent the morning laughing at. Pruitt turned from the colonel and faced Rourke and the detail and the last of the watching Marines, and he did not raise his voice, and every person on that end of the deck heard him anyway, because the deck had gone quiet in the way a place goes quiet when something enormous is about to be said. Corporal Rourke, Pruitt let the name sit. The woman you have been mocking all morning is Sergeant Major Winifred Hollis, United States Marine Corps, Force Reconnaissance, retired. That ribbon at her throat is the Medal of Honor. She was awarded it for carrying 3 wounded Marines down a mountain under fire in 1969, and one of them is the reason we are standing on this deck today. His name is on that stone. He let a breath go by. By regulation, and by every tradition this Corps has, every Marine on this deck renders honors to her first. The Colonel renders honors to her first. You do not touch her. You do not speak to her. You stand at attention, and you pray she is a more forgiving Marine than you have given her any reason to be. The phone in Whitcomb's hand came down slowly, forgotten, still filming the concrete. Ferris had gone the color of paper, and Rourke's face began to move through the only sequence left to it. First confusion, a small, stubborn frown that this could not be right. Then disbelief, a glance at the old woman, at the shaking hands, at the small blue ribbon, looking for the joke and not finding it. Then recognition, the slow, horrible arrival of understanding, the medal, the mountain, the name on the stone, the morning he had spent, the video, the whole grinning, cruel morning of it rolling back over him at once. And then horror, plain and total. The horror of a young man who has just learned exactly what he has done and knows there is no taking any of it back. Private Vance was already at attention. He had come to attention the moment Pruitt said the word medal, before anyone told him to, and he stood there straight and pale and did not tremble. And he was the only one of the young men on that cordon who could look at the old woman at all. Colonel Ashford stepped past Rourke as though the corporal were a lamppost. He came to the front of the old woman's chair, and he faced her, and he came to attention himself, and he called it down the whole formation in a voice that cracked once and did not break. Detail. A beat. Present. Arms. And the whole deck came up in a wave. Hundreds of white-gloved hands rose to hundreds of covered brows. The cordon and the color guard, and the band, and the honor detail, and every Marine in dress blues on that wind-scoured concrete, all of them turning to face the small, red-coated woman in the folding chair, all of them holding the salute. The reviewing officer held it. The sergeant held it. The boy who had knocked her chair askew held it now with tears standing in his eyes and his jaw locked shut. The wind came off the deck in one more long, flat sheet, and it moved nothing, because nothing on that field was moving except the flags. There is a thing that happens to a young man's face when the whole shape of a morning turns over at once, and it happened to Tyler Rourke's face on that deck in front of everyone, and he would feel it happening and be unable to stop it. He would remember, later, that the worst part was not the colonel, and was not the gunnery sergeant, and was not the video. The worst part was the salute. The worst part was standing in a formation of hundreds of Marines, with his own white glove locked at his own brow, holding honors he had not earned the right to withhold, for a woman he had mimicked and challenged and taken by the arm, and watching her rise on her own to return it. He had thought that morning that he understood what the uniform meant. He understood something different now, something that would take him years to say in words, about who the uniform was for, and about how quietly the people who had paid the most for it tended to wear it. Winifred Hollis looked at them for a long moment. Then she rose, once more, without a hand, and squared herself, and brought her trembling right hand up to the brow of her white head, and returned their salute, slow and shaking, and correct to the millimeter, the way she had returned it and rendered it 10,000 times across a life none of them had known she led. Hundreds of Marines held a salute to a trembling old woman in a red coat, and the only sound on the whole parade deck was the wind she had never once flinched against. What came after came quietly, the way the important things do. Colonel Ashford did not make a spectacle of the reckoning. He did not have to. He had Rourke, Whitcomb, and Ferris quietly detached from the cordon and marched to the company gunnery sergeant, a barrel-chested man who had heard the whole story by the time they reached him, and whose face promised each of them a great many mornings they would not enjoy. The phone and its video were surrendered. Rourke would be relieved from the ceremonial detail before the day was out, and what waited past that, the counseling and the paperwork, and the long, slow climb back toward being the kind of Marine who could be trusted in front of the colors, would be his to carry for a long time. Vance was quietly told, by the gunnery sergeant himself, that a Marine who moves an old woman's chair into the shade while his betters are laughing is worth more than the 3 who laughed, and to keep on being exactly who he was. But before any of it went further, the old woman asked the colonel for something. She asked him to go easy. "They're only boys, Colonel," she said. Her shaking hand rested on the sleeve of his dress blues, light as a leaf. "Look at them. They're younger than the ones I carried. The boys I came for today never got to grow old enough to be foolish. Sammy Cordell never got to be 20. That one there, a small tremor toward Rourke, standing gray-faced at attention, gets to be 22 and stupid and to learn better, and that is a gift the mountain never gave my Marines. So let him learn. Don't break him. Teach him. That's all any of this was ever for." Ashford, who had buried men and pinned medals and thought himself past being moved, had to look away for a moment at the shrouded stone before he could answer her, and when he answered, he only said, "Yes, Sergeant Major," in a voice gone rough, and it was the first time in 57 years that anyone had said her rank to her on a parade deck and meant it as an order she could give. And Rourke, standing gray and rigid at attention through all of it, heard the old woman ask for mercy on his behalf, and it undid him more completely than any punishment could have. It is one thing to be broken by the person you have wronged. It is another thing entirely to be spared by them, to stand there having earned the worst and be handed, instead, the chance to become better by the very woman you spent the morning mocking. He would carry that longer than the counseling and the paperwork and the relief from the detail. He would carry it the way she carried her Marines, as a weight that did not lighten and was not meant to, a weight that taught him, one heavy year at a time, the exact size of what she had refused to take from him. Some lessons only mercy can teach, and only to those who did nothing to deserve it. If a story ever reminded you that mercy is the last and hardest thing the strong have left to give, that it is easy to repay cruelty, and it costs everything to answer it with grace, then carry this old woman's mercy out of here with you, and subscribe to the veteran vault, so her story finds the people who need to be reminded of it, Then they took the cloth off the stone. It came away in the wind, with a soft sound, and the monument stood bare in the hard, bright light. A long, low wall of pale granite, with a great many names cut into it. The roll of a reconnaissance company that had gone up a mountain in 1969. The old woman looked at it the way she had looked at it all morning through the cloth, as if she had always been able to read it. Then she asked to be taken to one line of it, near the bottom, on the left. Pruitt took one of her arms and Vance took the other, and the two of them, the sergeant who had known her name and the private who had moved her chair, steadied her shaking hands as she lowered herself, slowly, painfully, all the way down onto her knees on the cold concrete at the foot of the wall. And she reached up with one trembling hand and laid her open palm flat against a name cut into the granite. Cordell Samuel R. Her hand did not shake against the stone. That was the strange and final thing, the thing that Pruitt would tell his own grandchildren about one day, that the hand, which had trembled through the whole long morning, through the anthem and the mockery and the salute and the wind, went still the moment it touched that name, as still as it had been on the mountain, as still as it had been all those years ago when it had something to hold. "There you are," she said, very softly, to the granite, to the boy inside it. "I told you I'd come back. I told you I'd never put you down. I never did. I've been carrying you the whole time, Sammy. All of it. Every year you didn't get." Her voice did not break. It was the level, dry, calm voice she had used all morning, and it was somehow worse for that. The voice of a woman who had made her peace with grief so long ago that it lived in her now like weather. "I brought your medal. It was always yours. I just kept it warm." She stayed a while at the wall. No one hurried her. The colonel had quietly passed the word that the rest of the program would wait, that the deck would hold as long as it needed to hold, and so the ceremony that had almost laughed her off its own front row now arranged its entire self around the small, kneeling figure in the red coat, and waited on her the way it should have waited from the beginning. She read the names near his, the ones cut into the stone above and below him, and some of them, she said under her breath. The low country boy and the two brothers from Ohio, and the corpsman who had gone back up the trail one time too many, all of them 19 and 20 and 21 forever, all of them younger now than her own grandchildren, all of them hers in the particular and permanent way that the dead you carried are always yours. She had outlived every one of them by more than half a century. She had grown old and shaking in a country most of them never got to see grow up, and she had spent a good part of that long life feeling faintly guilty for the crime of the years, forgetting to have them when the boys on the stone did not. And the only way she had ever found to make it bearable was this: to come, when she could, and put her hand on the granite and tell them she remembered, because she was the last one left who did. The wind moved the flags and moved nothing else. Behind her the whole deck stood in silence, the colonel and the sergeant and the private and the gray-faced boy learning his hard lesson and the hundreds who had held the salute, and none of them spoke, because there are moments a Marine knows better than to put words into. After a while she let Pruitt and Vance lift her back to her feet, and she stood a moment longer with her hand on the stone, and then she took it away, and the trembling came back into it, the way the tide comes back. She walked off the deck slowly, on no one's arm, the small red coat growing smaller against the long white wall behind her, an old woman with shaking hands who had come a long way to keep a promise and had kept it. Sergeant Deacon Pruitt watched her go, and he was not the same man who had formed up the cordon that morning, and he knew he never would be again. He would go home that night and take down a thick blue book he had not opened in years, and he would find a name in it he had read 1,000 times, and this time he would know the woman it belonged to, and he would understand at last what his grandfather had been trying to tell him all along, that the loudest valor is almost never the real thing, and that the real thing walks quietly among us with shaking hands and lets itself be laughed at rather than say what it is, and asks nothing, and forgives the ones who mock it, and carries its dead the whole way home, and never, ever puts them down. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.